Well, during the interval, we're going to anticipate that symphony with I'm Sorry I Killed Your Fish. As I say, Shostakovich famously got into trouble with Stalin, who found some of his music too bourgeois and decadent. His Fifth Symphony, subtitled A Soviet Artist's Reply to Just Criticism, was the composer's act of public contrition. Well, in this essay, the Polish linguist Eva Ogiermann considers how different nations say sorry and why the British and Russians don't understand each other's apologies.
During Shostakovich's lifetime, the success of his work depended not so much on how it was received by audiences and critics, as how it was seen by the Communist Party and the extent to which his compositions supported Soviet propaganda. His satirical opera, The Nose, was censured for its bourgeois decadence, but the climax of Shostakovich's conflict with Stalin came with his opera Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk. The opera had already been running for 2 years and with nearly 200 productions was clearly an international success, when Stalin decided to attend the performance himself. His verdict appeared in an unsigned editorial in the newspaper Pravda, entitled Sumbur wmiesто muzyki, muddle instead of music. The opera was criticized as deliberately dissonant and pornographic and fully incompatible with the ideals of socialist realism. Lady Macbeth was banned and Shostakovich was declared an enemy of the people. This happened during the Great Purge of the late 1930s, in which numerous artists were arrested and millions of Soviet citizens sent to Siberia or murdered. And Shostakovich was painfully aware that if he didn't manage to placate Stalin, it could cost him his life. But how do you make up with somebody like Stalin? Shostakovich did the only thing he could do, and the thing he could do best. He wrote a symphony that sounded melodic and simple, a symphony that, at least on the surface, embraced the doctrine of socialist realism. His Fifth Symphony, which carried the subtitle A Soviet Artist's Reply to Just Criticism, is generally viewed as Shostakovich's public apology, an apology that succeeded in eliciting forgiveness from somebody as powerful and as ruthless as Stalin. As a linguist, I have done extensive research into apologies in English, Russian, German, and Polish. And while not all of them were verbal, symphonies don't often figure in my findings. While for Shostakovich simply saying sorry to Stalin was clearly not a viable solution to the problem, public apologies have become increasingly popular in recent years. In the past 2 decades, Britain has witnessed a flood of public apologies. Many of these apologies were offered on behalf of the government for wrongdoings which happened in the past. Gordon Brown has apologized on behalf of the government for the child migration policy, which separated children from their families and sent them to Australia. Health Minister Mike O'Brien has apologized to the victims of the thalidomide scandal. Tony Blair issued a kind of apology on behalf of the British government for the Irish potato famine and attempted another one on behalf of the entire nation for Britain's role in the slave trade. Such public apologies tend to be controversial, partly because they don't really fulfill the function of apologies. Apologies are generally defined as compensatory actions, through which the speaker admits responsibility for an offence committed against the hearer. This is problematic if the concept of the hearer is extended to the general public and the speaker is not responsible for the event that he apologizes for, especially if it has happened before he or she was born. We generally recognize apologies because they contain certain words or phrases associated with apologizing. English apologies overwhelmingly use words that express regret, and it's words of regret that appear in English public apologies. British politicians tend to express their sincere regret or deep sorrow. These formulations come in the plural, as in we wish to express, and the regrettable deeds they refer to appear in the passive voice, such as we are sorry that their voices were not heard. Hence, the apologizers are many, and those responsible remain unmentioned. In Russia, politicians seem much less willing than British ones to issue public apologies on behalf of previous governments, which is not to say that Russian politicians don't apologize. In his resignation speech, broadcast on Russian television, Boris Yeltsin apologized for disappointing Russian citizens and for his naivety that made him believe that things would be easier while they turned out difficult. He introduced his apology with the expression «Я хочу попросить у вас прощения», which translates as «I want to beg for your forgiveness», and then he repeated «Я прошу прощения», «I beg forgiveness». He emphasized the sincerity of his apology by saying that he feels the pain felt by each Russian citizen in his own heart. According to one Russian periodical, Yeltsin's successor, Vladimir Putin, apologized 87 times during public speeches delivered between 2000 and 2009. 55 times he used the formulae «извините» and «простите», with both translating as «forgive me». 26 times he chose to beg for forgiveness with «прошу прощения» or «прошу извинения», and also used some more elaborate variants expressing the wish to be forgiven. Most of the apologies were for interrupting others, party members as well as journalists, and for using inappropriate language. As these examples illustrate, the Russian concept of apology, reflected in the conventional expressions used to apologize, differs fundamentally from the concept of apology reflected in the English language. The Russian apology consists in the speaker admitting that he is guilty and asking to be freed from this guilt. This makes it exceedingly difficult for today's leaders to apologize on behalf of Russia for deeds committed by a long-dead dictator who harmed his own people most. From a linguistic point of view, the British politicians have a much easier job when asked to apologize for historical events, because all they need to do is express regret. And expressions of regret have the advantage of being ambiguous. Saying sorry may constitute an apology in the sense of admitting culpability and asking for forgiveness, or it may simply express regret that an unfortunate event has occurred without admitting responsibility for it, in which case the use of the word sorry does not result in an apology. This ambiguity allows English-speaking politicians to use the vocabulary associated with apologizing to merely acknowledge that something regrettable has happened in the past. It also explains why British people like saying sorry as much as they like saying please and thank you. It does not cost them much and makes interpersonal encounters so much more pleasant and polite. Visitors to the UK, who have learned that sorry is the word to use when you want to apologize, are absolutely amazed when they receive apologies for the bad English weather. The word sorry seems to materialize pretty much every time two people come near each other, just in case they might be in each other's way. Sorry is an element preceding questions, requests, complaints, and all other forms of verbal threats invading the privacy of the person they are directed at. When, despite all the care that has been taken to avoid this, two people somehow manage to bump into each other, they both tend to say sorry. And it might even be the person who got the other's elbow in the face that says sorry first. What does it matter who was responsible for the collision? Nobody intended it, and everybody regrets that it happened. An exchange of sorry simply acknowledges both parties' right to non-destruction. As a native of Poland, new to England, I quickly learned to say sorry every time I seemed to be getting in somebody's way. It became so natural and automatic that I carried on using it in other countries. Once in Germany, a woman who seemed to be in a great hurry almost knocked me over. As I felt the pressure of her high-heeled shoes on my toes, I couldn't help saying "Entschuldigung," the equivalent of the English sorry, or rather apology. She gave me a confused look and took about half a second to adjust to the situation before she shouted, "Look where you're going." Qui s'excuse, s'accuse, as the French say. Back in the UK, I am always pleasantly amused when I'm riding my bike and stop at a zebra crossing, and the people crossing the road smile at me and say sorry, or some of them say thank you. Basically, in this situation, sorry and thank you seem to be interchangeable. It doesn't really matter if they acknowledge that they have inconvenienced me or appreciate that I have stopped on their behalf. Both expressions function as tokens of recognition, and even cars that stop at zebra crossings are sometimes smiled at, waved at. In Germany, pedestrians view zebra crossings as their territory, and so most of them don't even watch out for cars as they cross the road. And why should they apologize to people who are merely following regulations? After all, pedestrians also follow regulations. They stop when traffic lights turn red and obediently wait for them to turn green. Even if there are no cars to be seen, it is 3 o'clock in the morning and it's pouring down with rain. Ordnung muss sein. Ultimately, if there is a rule for everything and everybody sticks to the rules, there is no need for anyone to apologize. In Russia, cars tend not to stop for pedestrians. The unwritten rule is that whoever has got a car has got the power. But then again, a driver who stopped at a zebra crossing in front of a tube station in Moscow would find himself confronted with the power of the masses and end up sitting there until the last tube passenger had come home from work. Clearly, life differs across countries, and so do the ways in which people interact with one another. We can only compare people's communicative behavior if we observe them in identical situations, but we will never find them in such situations unless we conduct an experiment. That's what I decided to do in my research on apologies. I needed to find situations which were likely to happen and which would be perceived as offensive in all the countries under study, in this case Britain, Russia and Poland. I also wanted to know how people's behavior differed depending on whether they had offended strangers or friends and people of higher or lower status than themselves, and how men and women differed. Unfortunately, I couldn't engineer scenarios in which people did things they had to apologize for, so I had to ask them to imagine what they would say if they did find themselves in such situations. I came up with a questionnaire featuring 8 offensive scenarios. For example, one of them described a situation in which the respondents had been asked to look after their friend's pet fish as he went on holiday, but they didn't have time to feed the fish as often as necessary, and some of them died. I'll come back to the dead fish in a minute, but let's first look at the overall picture. My results showed that the English were most likely to use words or phrases conventionally used to apologize, and the Russians were the least likely to. And although all 3 languages contain formulae expressing regret, requesting forgiveness, and offering an apology, speakers of each language showed a strong preference for one particular type. The British respondents almost exclusively used the phrase "I'm sorry" or its short version, sorry. The Russians mainly used the verbs "izvinite" and "простите" and other formulations requesting forgiveness. The Poles, by contrast, showed a strong preference for the word "przepraszam", which translates as "I apologize". This is what linguists call a performative, a verb form that performs the act of apologizing. These preferences reflect 3 very different concepts of apologizing. The essential element of English apologies is regret. Russian apologies consist of admitting responsibility and being forgiven. And Polish apologies are performative acts. Hence, when Polish people say "przepraszam", there is no doubt that they have produced an apology. From an English point of view, however, choosing the phrase "I apologize" over "I'm sorry" could imply that no regret is felt. And from a Russian point of view, saying sorry does not constitute an apology, because expressing regret does not entail accepting responsibility. Of course, you could argue that every language has an expression that its speakers conventionally use to apologize. This is the word they have internalized as they acquired the language, and they use it without reflecting upon its meaning. However, when children acquire language, they also learn how to be a competent member of their society, and so they also learn when to apologize and what it means to apologize. The question I have tried to answer in my study was, therefore, does the apology behavior of Britons, Poles and Russians reflect the concepts of apologizing inherent in the formulaic expressions they use to apologize? In other words, does language influence behavior? Which brings me to the fish. In all 3 languages, some respondents chose to apologize, while others avoided apologizing. But what was most striking was how they referred to the offense and the responsibility for it. The English-speaking respondents not only denied responsibility most often, but also tended to distance themselves from the offense. This doesn't mean that they avoided expressing regret. In fact, they often found the situation highly regrettable. They would say things like, "Sorry, I don't know what happened, they must have died." And when they did choose to admit responsibility, they did so very carefully. "I think I might not have fed them properly." The Russians were much more explicit in this situation. If they apologized, they accepted responsibility and usually also offered to replace the fish. But if they chose not to apologize, they didn't add any apologetic embellishments as did the British. While Poles would also sometimes deny responsibility, the explanations were much more elaborate and effusive than those of the British and Russians. One of the respondents wrote, "Sorry, but I think that some of the fish got ill. They were looking a bit sluggish and the next day they died. I didn't know what to do. I hope you're not angry with me." Clearly, the fish were well looked after and died despite all the attention they received. It seemed that whether they denied or accepted responsibility, the Polish respondents were mainly concerned about their future relationship with their friend, and some were very emotional and self-critical. One, for example, wrote, "I hope you'll get over this somehow and will not start hating me." On the whole, the data show a general tendency for British people to avoid any unnecessary reference to the offence, for Russians to be brief and to the point, and for Poles to invent all sorts of circumstances placing them in a better light. Another scenario I used described a situation in which the respondents had a party in their flat, and the next day they had to face the landlady who complained about the noise. Again, British respondents referred to the offence in a rather vague way. They used statements of fact. "Sorry, we had a bit of a party," or "Sorry, we had a few friends round last night," they would say. The women especially showed themselves very concerned. "Oh, sorry, did we keep you up?" Or "Sorry, did I disturb you?" "Of course you did. This is what I've come to complain about," a Russian landlady might say. A strategy that was most frequent in the Polish data was claiming to have lost control over the situation. The guests kept coming and coming, or even a friend brought people with her that I didn't know and I couldn't get rid of them. The Russians didn't blame anybody but themselves and asserted, "We are young. I'm sure you understand. You were like that when you were young." These results seem to confirm that it's not just the form of words, sorry versus forgive me versus I apologise, that differs across the three languages. Britons, Poles and Russians really do think differently about the meaning of apologising. Saying sorry in English does not necessarily mean that the speaker is apologising. He might not even be regretting what happened. Saying sorry can be merely a way of being polite. The Russians don't express regret when they want to apologise, and understandably, they don't beg for forgiveness if they don't feel responsible for the offence. The Poles have a very unambiguous way of apologising, but saying I apologise does not stop them from coming up with lots of circumstances that apparently reduce their responsibility for what they apologise for. So what lies behind these differences? I think it's to do with different cultural understandings of politeness. British culture is generally regarded as what politeness theorists call a negative politeness culture, a culture that places great value on privacy, where politeness is used to signal that the speaker is reluctant to interfere with the hearer's freedom of action. The main feature of negative politeness is indirectness. Hence, British people, especially if they want something from one another, avoid saying what they really mean, or at least they will say sorry first. Polish and Russian cultures, in contrast, have been defined as positive politeness cultures. The use of positive politeness expresses solidarity. It signals the hearer that his presence is appreciated and his wants and desires are shared. Accordingly, while directness can seem rude, imposing or bossy to a British person, Russians associate it with sincerity and closeness. Most theoretical work on politeness has been done by people with an Anglo-Saxon cultural background. It is therefore not surprising that negative politeness has been declared to be more polite than positive politeness. It's probably also why politeness theory is based on the assumption that all interpersonal communication constitutes a threat, and politeness is a way of minimizing this threat. This is done by means of various politeness strategies, such as the words sorry, please, or thank you. More recent theoretical work on politeness rejects the idea that linguistic structures can be inherently polite. It emphasizes the unpredictable nature of politeness and links it with power. Some even go as far as to claim that polite behavior is meant to enhance one's standing with respect to others. While this new approach may account for the manifold ways in which the word sorry is used in English, it is difficult to use it to study politeness in countries such as Russia, where true politeness is said to come from the heart. British people tend to overuse the word sorry in situations that don't require an apology and in ways that don't result in an apology. Russians don't apologize if they don't mean it. At the same time, offensive situations are often repaired without using apology expressions, and sometimes even without saying a word. If you step on somebody's foot in Russia, the polite thing to do may be to offer your own foot to be stepped on to even things up. Clearly, the more serious the offence and the consequences of not apologizing, the more important it becomes to offer something more substantial than an apology formula. Shostakovich's symphony, for instance, contained two essential elements of an apology: repair and a promise not to repeat the offence. By writing something designed to please Stalin, Shostakovich implicitly admitted that what he previously did was wrong, and he showed that he could do it right. Not that he always did. Shostakovich carried on going in and out of favor with the Soviet authorities for the rest of his life. His Eighth Symphony, for example, was banned between 1948 and 1956. Stalin accepted the apology over the Fifth. This was convenient. It allowed Shostakovich to carry on composing and let the Soviet Union carry on using him for propaganda purposes. If nothing else, the affair shows that sincerity is not an indispensable component of apologies, even in Russia.
I'm sorry I killed your fish was presented by Eva Ogiermann.